Hey folks, today we're going to talk about an adult subject matter which isn't in the least appropriate for little ones. So if you have one around, you might want to wait till later to listen.
They republished my handedness piece. And I get an email from GSA a couple of days later, and they're like, "We're really sorry, but we've been contacted by a nun, and we'd really like you to follow up in a
Science is for
nice
everyone,
way."
all backgrounds, all ages, all genders, and all walks of life deserve an education. Come be one of
Thomas,
us.
welcome in. Could you give us a quick intro as always? Let the party people
Thank you.
know who, if they don't know, who is the legendary Dr. Merritt.
Hey, my name's Thomas Merritt. I'm a professor at Laurentian University in Northern Ontario, which is 4 hours north of Toronto. I study the genetics of stress using fruit flies, which is how Belinda and I know each other. Um, and I drink a lot of coffee. So I often talk about coffee, but we're going to talk about some other things this evening, including my longstanding fascination with handedness. Is that good for an intro?
That's great for an intro.
So we've talked about a bunch of different things. I have been writing pop sci since maybe 2017, 2016, something like that. One of the early articles that I wrote was on the genetics of handedness. And it was actually because one of the science editor at that time for the conversation where I often publish, he was interested in handedness and said, you should write about this. And so I was like, I'd love to. My high school, so in high school, at least in the States where you have yearbooks, right, and you've got your little inspirational quotes or, the quote about you. My quote was, I'd give my right arm to be ambidextrous. So,
That's a good
yeah,
quote.
okay,
I
so
like that.
I'll wait for that one to get, thanks for the polite chuckle. That was awesome. So yeah, I've been thinking about handedness for a very long period of time. And so I was like, yeah, I would totally love to write about handedness. And it ends up that everybody knows what handedness is. And we know surprisingly little about the genetics behind handedness, which honestly is sort of a constant theme in modern genetics. Like we think we've got a handle on things, and then we realize we really don't. But handedness is sort of an interesting beast because essentially everybody has some version of handedness. One of the really odd things about us, about modern humans anyway, is we are almost always right-handed. So the title of the piece that I wrote was "Why Are You Not Left-Handed?" And I did that intentionally because I'm only going to offend about 12% of the population who are, left-handed. But it ends up that we know surprisingly little about the genetics of that, although it just permeates everything. And so, as part of that piece, I wrote a one sentence one liner that said, "Handedness is involved with so many aspects of our lives, including the decidedly adult occupation or habit or something that we've all just thought of." So I was pitching this to a friend of mine. We were at a science conference banquet, and she's like, "You mean that masturbation has handedness?" And I was like, "Yes, yes, actually it does." And she said, "Oh, would you like to give a talk about that?" And I was like, "Oh." So the classic like underqualified white male response of, "I would totally give an entire seminar on the handedness of masturbation, of course." And then when I sat down to work on this, a friend of mine was like, "You don't have a talk. You've got like three-quarters of a sentence." And I was like, "Oh, I can turn three-quarters of a sentence into a talk, no problem." So I did, and I ended up talking for about 45 minutes on various different things, but including the genetics of handedness and the genetics of masturbation.
Are those
There's
two linked?
Yeah,
Okay.
they are, and so and it's actually sort of, well, like many things, it's super cool. Um, I was giving this talk in the age of Twitter, and so one of the things that I asked when I would start the talk, I would say, "Okay, everybody, get on your phone, open up your Twitter app, and I want you to respond to this tweet and tell me right or left. So are you, or actually no? So what I was saying was dominant or not dominant. So the question was, did you predominantly masturbate with your dominant hand or your not dominant hand? The hand gestures are key to this discussion, right? And so I would lead with that, and we would discuss all the various aspects of that. And when I gave this talk the first time, one of the members of the audience came up to me afterwards, and because I would put it dominant hand, not dominant hand, both hands, and then in parentheses, you're just bragging, right? And so this woman came up to me after the talk, and she's like, that's incredibly biased. Many women actually masturbate with both hands, and you're just completely discounting that. And I was like, So, like many things in science, because I was approaching this from this male perspective, it never occurred to me that I was bringing my bias into this story as a male, and from a female perspective, that the question really meant something very different. So, there are lots of really interesting things about handedness. One was exposing my subtle, unintentional bias in the way that I was pitching questions. But like this goes back to a point we've talked about over and over again. It's really important to have a diversity of voices asking questions because you don't realize when you're asking questions from a really biased perspective, which I was doing in what I thought was a really funny way, but unintentionally. So I was unintentionally being sexist in the way that I was addressing it.
And one thing
But
that you've mentioned with regards to that too is that in funding and different grants now there is always the assumption that there's going to be something about the sex difference that you're testing as well, right? Because you can't just test it in one sex and assume that it applies to everyone.
100%. And so we have gotten better at science of ensuring that that was the case. But the and that's super important because we really do to understand something. You need to understand potentially both male and female aspects. But I thought what this really drove home to me was that it it's also the kind of questions that we ask reflect who we are. And when I was doing a little bit of the background for today's chat, I was looking things like you mentioned squirrels, and I was like, oh, I don't know what I said about squirrels. And so I was like trying to figure out, what I could possibly say. But it's amazing that the number of times where there's obviously bias in the way that we're asking questions. So I really would love to know what the comment that I made about squirrel sex was because I have zero recollection of bringing up squirrels. I will tell you that one of the funny things in putting together that genetics of masturbation talk was trying to look into animal kingdom masturbation and trying to find something that was like scholarly and not just pornographic. And the
Are,
one thing that kept popping up,
are there scholarly things in that? Like how
oh,
often is something like that scholarly?
like a lot, like a surprisingly amount. So one of the things that kept coming up was a reference to porcupines and dildo use, and I was like, oh, okay, and it's sort of an interesting combination. Like, and why does it show up over and over again? So this was it just. So I went back and tried to find the original article, and at least at the time, the articles that I could find never mentioned dildo use. And I was like, okay, how did it get into popular culture? It was like there was an article in Cosmo or something that mentioned porcupines and dildos. I was like, but I can't. So I finally found the article yesterday. And it's in what's it? The American Journal of Mammalogy, 1940. Sorry, just the Journal of Mammalogy from 1946. And the quote is literally later the female occasionally stimulates her genitals by rubbing them on some protruding structure such as a stick, a food or water crock, or the frame or wire of the cage. I do not claim to be an expert in female dildo use, but I mean I have a computer, and I've had a series of girlfriends, and I would tell you that in no case have I ever watched this act and thought it looked like a female rubbing against a protruding stick or water crock. So it's definitely a stretch from this original 1946 to this recurring reference that porcupines use dildos. But it's like the perspective. Like this
So
is
you also ran into the issue too of how citations matter and how citations can get twisted.
so citations. Yeah, well, it's a twisted thing. Is it once somebody said this sentence that I just read you translates to porcupines use dildos, then you don't have to go to the original. You just go back to restating this over and over and over again. And it's like I yeah, it's a bit of a stretch. Anyway, it was interesting.
Actually thank you for going down that rabbit hole though, because it's like right, if you said if someone just found it in Cosmo or just any other of these papers and it's like this citation, like you're not going to go back and look at the original
Yeah.
data, right? You're just going to see it cited and you'll be like, oh, that's it. And actually, like we were on the front page last Friday talking about weird reproductive behaviors in animals, and porcupines, it turns out, actually like pee on each other before it's time to mate in order to like smell what the like if they're kind of raring to go, as it were.
It's funny you should mention that because one of the things I found was a series of mentions to fellatio and cunnilingus, and basically the role of oral sex. And one of them, let me see if I actually wrote this down and can read it. Um, lemurs. So in some lemurs, the males initiate oral sex to see if the female is an estrus. And I will tell you, I have never used that line, but it does seem like, it's an interesting sort of. I'm just curious, and in the name of science, if we could perhaps, yeah.
And
Anyway,
now that we're down this rabbit hole from chat, humans are the only animal to perform fellatio.
no, no, they're not, and so it's amazing. Sorry, it is actually sort of amazing. Like one, I was like, wow, this is what I'm doing. So I will tell you the contrast between reviewing the federal grants until 3:20 this afternoon and then hopping over to let me look at fellatio in the animal kingdom. I was like, yeah, I needed this
A palate
release.
cleanser at this point.
So it ends up that a series of animals engage in either male or female driven oral sex for various different reasons. The article that I was reading is in PLOS One, is on fruit bat fellatio, and the females perform fellatio on the mating male during copulation. And so one, sort of shocking, and then B, the correlation is that the copulation lasts longer if the female performs fellatio during copulation. I will tell you that I have very little personal experience of this, but I would not have guessed that if the female began to lick the penis, that it would actually extend the period of copulation and not shorten it. But in fact, it does. So there's a whole series of speculations as to the role of fellatio, and one of them, and this is, I'm not even making this up, but recurring through a series of articles, is the transfer of antibacterial saliva.
That's being produced by the performee.
Correct.
That is interesting on its own. Like, how does the body know when it's time to produce those antibacterials, or is it always producing them?
Yeah. And so that the argument is that saliva has antibacterial properties, and so what's evolved is this behavior that transfers that saliva that has antibacterial. You mentioned the squirrel thing. Like I said, I really wish I knew what I had said about squirrel sex. I have a series of squirrel stories, none of which involve sex, and I have a series of sex stories, none of which involved squirrels. I did, however, find a folder on my hard drive that said squirrel masturbation. So I was like, oh, well, I mean, there you go. So it ends up that in promiscuous ground squirrels, the males masturbate copiously. And there's so apparently, well, a couple of things. Masturbation is not that uncommon in the animal kingdom. Multiple reproductions is not uncommon in the animal kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
In this ground squirrel, there is a lot of mating. And surprisingly, if you mate a lot, so if you just think, so picture for a second, we've got this mating system in squirrels. So we've got these communal squirrels, a lot of sex going on, a lot of promiscuous sex, so lots of different partners. There is a correlation with masturbation. Like, okay, if I take my male human, modern human centric perspective, my thought would be, okay, as the dominant successful male copulations go up, the not dominant, not successful male masturbations would go up. And in fact, that is not the case. So the most copious masturbators are the most successful male maters.
Huh.
And they masturbate more in the mating season and even more directly after mating.
And they're the most successful.
They are the most successful.
That would be a little bit backwards from what you might predict.
Well, and so I have this little note here saying super counterintuitive, but it's super counterintuitive from
the human perspective,
okay.
Yeah.
Right. And so it ends up, so the author was trying to speculate as to what would be driving this. And this is where we got back to this antimicrobial saliva thing. So what the author speculates in this story, in this paper, is that the masturbation is in fact a form of grooming, and that they are grooming post copulation because you're most likely to. The idea is that grooming reduces STIs or the transmission of STIs, and so what's evolved is this anti-STI behavior, which is grooming. And so that led me down to the series of things that were so this fruit bath fellatio thing that was this antimicrobial saliva issue. What's missing in all of this is any indication that actually fruit bats or ground squirrels have STIs, and it just this is not my area of expertise. But both authors seem to be making arguments based on reducing infections without, as far as I could see, any indication of infection. So there still seem to be a bit of a bias there, as this is what would make sense from a human population. I was having trouble connecting the dots to make it make sense in either fruit bats or ground squirrels.
But it is established that there are antimicrobial peptides, right? So it's like you're maybe led being in that direction of there must be something against infection, and so you're just assuming that an infection exists without actually yet proving it.
Yeah. And so what we know is these guys are yanking it like you wouldn't believe. And what's really striking is that rate, actually, the rate of masturbation actually goes up with the rate of successful copulation. Like, okay, and that's not what we expect. So, and there are a couple of questions like, why wouldn't you expect it? One of the things is with like repeated ejaculations, the volume of ejaculate in the sperm count tends to go down. And so, okay, if that's going down, isn't that counterproductive? Well, not if you're actually keeping yourself from getting STIs, because there is evidence in a lot of taxa that even mild STIs reduce the frequency of copulation.
So,
So,
you might be less likely to produce offspring because of sperm count going down, but that's a much smaller decrease than if you had an STI.
and if you're not having sex because you have an STI, exactly. Yeah.
What I want to highlight to the chat is, while we're a little tongue in cheek and we're like smiling a lot talking to this, there is a lot of science in these data sets, right?
Can you use a phrase other than tongue in cheek?
Toe in mouth?
I was just kidding. It was an oral sex joke.
Is toe in mouth not better?
No, it's really not. So you're entirely correct. So there's a lot of really good science, and there's a lot of reason for this. So a lot of endangered species, an issue with trying to recover or trying to maintain endangered species is getting them to reproduce. And the more we understand about reproduction broadly, the better chance we have of actually maintaining those endangered species.
See, now putting it into that context is really cool, right? So that
So
it could, right? Because otherwise you could be like, well, why are you just wasting money on studying this self gratification in a ground squirrel? And now all of a sudden it's like, well, if we don't understand these basic behaviors, you can't begin to rescue the animal if it's starting to go down the path of extinction.
Yep. Yeah,
and
100%.
That's an incredible way of framing it. We do have a question too, like with the ground squirrels and others. Does this prove successful because of release of any extra pheromones, like any extra pheromonal cues that could be linked to the extra linked gratification?
Yeah, that's really. I didn't see any mention of that, and I don't know these systems well enough to know what's driving the frequency of copulation. That's certainly a super cool aspect that I didn't see addressed, but really interesting. One of the things that I did see that was actually really interesting in human sperm quality was that masturbation was correlated with better sperm quality in humans. And basically, the argument is frequent masturbation keeps the sperm that are present young, and young sperm are healthier, faster swimmers, more likely to fertilize. So that bit makes sense. But again, this is from our perspective, it makes sense.
So that you can't necessarily apply that same perspective to other animals' biology.
That's right. But and some things do and some things don't translate. So with the ground squirrel, they're having a lot of sex to begin with, and so the swimmers are not sitting there dormant for long periods of time. So that explanation didn't seem to fit here. The STI thing seems to fit, except I don't see the evidence that there actually are STIs in the population.
So it might even be like we had a comment from Smikes of maybe, and there would be a whole ethical debate on this, but if you could infect the squirrels with an STI and see if the transmission rate is different because of their behavior, right? It's like some kind of testing like that, or if you can't do it in a controlled manner, you have to actually find the STI in the wild.
Well, and so whether we would want to experiment, I mean, this is this is a benefit of working with model species, right? So you could do this with different species in the lab. You certainly would never do it in a wild population for fear of something really exploding. But you could certainly test it in a lab situation. I think that the first step would be, even just using environmental DNA or fecal DNA to look for evidence of pathogens in the populations. And you might be able to correlate the evidence of pathogens, like pathogen load across individuals, and do some comparisons there that would make a lot of sense.
Question from Pickle Old Man Murray Rick. Are there any studies or observations of diminution of quality of offspring or swimmers after repeated masturbation in these animals?
Yeah, so those are two different things. And again, this isn't exactly my field of study, but in general, um, aging sperm has been correlated with a decrease in offspring quality. But it's things like you get a higher mutation load in older sperm than you do in younger sperm. There's so little conventional wisdom, and again, there are probably some interesting exceptions to this, but there's so little actually transmitted by the sperm into the egg. Generally, this isn't the case in all cases. There's some giant sperm, and there's some really interesting nutritional things that are going on there. But in general, the sperm is contributing DNA, and what's coming from the other side, the egg quality is a bigger deal than the sperm. But I think there's a growing recognition that the quality of sperm seems to matter for offspring quality. I think there has been this sort of perhaps misconception that basically as long as the sperm can get the DNA there, they've done their job, and then it's on to the quality of the egg. And I don't think that's 100% the case, but there's definitely this asymmetry. And that's the whole point of sperm and egg, is that there's so much more resources generally coming from the egg than there are from a spermatozoa, that the age and the nutritional state of the male and female are really having different impacts on the offspring.
There's been studies too for like with human IVF that the optimal amount of time age of the sperm is 3 to 7 days old. And if it's any older, than the likelihood of a successful IVF, like even in a dish, right, chat, where they don't have to go anywhere, you put them together is much lower. So even in
Yeah.
a dish setting, it's actually has a difference. And an
No, that makes a lot of sense.
interesting question from Sparky: is the behavior of the squirrels or any of these other animals it could be applied to different in different locations? So is it a learned behavior or something cultural there that's passed on through like visual cues, or is it something innate to their genetics, or maybe a bit of both?
Yeah, it's probably a bit of both. And so I don't actually know that from the squirrel populations, and I don't know if those studies have been done. It did seem like this was something in this species of ground squirrel and not in other species of ground squirrel. So it'd be interesting to know populations. So one of the other organisms that pops up pretty frequently, if you, I don't know, Google animal masturbation, is bonobo chimpanzees. So bonobos are a close relative of the typical chimpanzee, morphologically, genetically distinct. They're morphologically distinct in interesting ways. One, the males have gigantic testicles, just absolutely grapefruit-like, and the females have very pronounced vulva. They have just essentially enormous. What's the scientific term for cooter? Um,
Nah.
Sorry, you're just gonna let that go
No,
about that?
I no, just I'm just chuckling at a comment from the one of our mods. Nice try, Dr. Merritt. I'm not Googling that.
All right. So, funny story. So, well, a couple of funny stories about chimpanzees. So, bonobo chimpanzees, so maybe surprisingly, were recognized as a separate species relatively recently. When I was in grad school, I went to a talk at Duke University, which has a real large primate group, on the sort of emerging studies of bonobos. And bonobos have some interesting distinctions from typical chimpanzees. The females tend to move and not the males, I think. There's a lot of female-female interactions that probably has to do with cementing social hierarchies and trying to keep the peace. Um, there's a lot of female-female sexual behavior that seems to have to do with the fact that females are moving. And so there's some trading of food, there's some trading of sexual favors. There's this thing called Gigi rubbing, where the females rub these pronounced genitalia. This is my visual for that together, and juvenile males participate in this sort of Gigi rubbing, and then it drops off. So I'm at this talk. I'm the new guy. I'm this 18-year-old kid. Everybody else is an established primatologist, and so they're discussing why Gigi rubbing drops off in males as they mature. And so I raise my hand. And I was like, I don't know. Do you think it's because they've got testicles the size of softballs, and the last thing you want to do is start banging those things together? Dead silence. The entire room just stopped, looked at me like, "Mm," and then looked at the woman who brought me there because I was a research student. Like, why are you bringing people like this? I will tell you though, 30 years later, I still think it's entirely reasonable that maybe they stopped Gigi rubbing because they've got balls the size of softballs, and the last thing I want to do is start banging those together.
Wait, so
There
you
was
didn't actually get any answer? You just
no,
got
they were like,
looks.
"That's a ridiculous question." I was like, "Seriously? I think it's a really good anyway, or suggestion, wasn't a question.
Well, because you're
Um,
tying anatomy to behavior, right? If there's anatomical changes with aging, maybe the link to the behavioral change, right? I don't think that's a wild question to ask.
I also think that anybody who's been kicked in the balls really thinks the last thing you want to do is start smacking softball-sized testicles together. Um, why did I bring this up?
Squirrels and handedness. Why are we right and left handed?
No, but okay, that's a different question. There was a thing about Gigi rubbing. Oh, the other thing about G. Well, so there is this behavior in and the bonobos come up because juvenile male bonobos exchange fellatio for like good favors and stuff. So they pop up in the fellatio story. But they're a primate, so it's maybe not surprising that they do that. The other sort of very personal funny story is this whole Gigi rubbing thing obviously really sunk into my consciousness as this 18-year-old picturing these bonobo chimpanzees performing Gigi rubbing, which is genital rubbing. It's literally the short abbreviation for genital rubbing is Gigi rubbing. So, okay, one of the things that we started to talk about was handedness. So we should probably not leave that. We don't understand the genetics of handedness. There's a suggestion that there may be sort of central genes, so a central locus that's involved with handedness. There's been some recent studies that suggest there are maybe a dozen genes that are modifying, and that's most likely in most traits. What we find is sometimes there is a central locus that has a large effect. You can think like blue eyes and brown eyes, but then it's modified by a bunch of other genes, which you can also think blue eyes, brown eyes. So my beautiful blue eyes are a slightly different blue than my daughter's beautiful blue eyes because of these other dozen genes that are modifying that. And so handedness seems to probably play into that. Um, but there's some really cool work, and so I sent you the link from the piece that I wrote, and there was a geneticist basically doing observational studies. And so there are a couple of things with handedness. So one is every population you look at, something like 80 to 90% of the population is right-handed. And then everybody else is what we call not right-handed. And that's because you've got versions between a dominant left hand and then ambidextrous between those. And there's some really cool things with like what is like trying to define handedness. There's a big societal part that plays into it. The hair whorl story was that it looks like the genes that determine the clockwise or counterclockwise spiral to your whirl of hair, that gene may be also linked to left and right handedness. And an interesting punchline in that story is what seems to be happening genetically is you're either right-handed or you genetically have the potential to be left-handed. And there's often, I mean, genetics is often about potential. And so there's a genetic component and then there's an environmental component. Um, what's often less appreciated is there's a random effect too. And so the handedness may be a really good example of you've got an allele that pushes you towards a dominant right, and then you've got alleles that push you to a dominant left. But what you have is the potential for dominant left, and then it may just be a developmental coin toss. And
There's that
so
bit of randomness added to it.
it looks like it's entirely random. So like you have the potential, and then half the time that potential is realized, that half is actually modified by societal things. So in the not too distant past, left-handedness was looked at it as being sinister. Sinistral is the same root. Um, so when I wrote that piece, I actually mentioned the fact that there are these stories of the nuns, beating you if you tried to write with your left hand. So the Genetic Society of America, of which you and I are both familiar, they republished my handedness piece. And I get an email from GSA a couple of days later, and they're like, "We're really sorry, but we've been contacted by a nun, and we'd really like you to follow up in a nice way with this person." And so halfway through the piece, I made this note about nuns basically beating you if you tried to write with your left hand. So this nun wrote in like, "That's mean and that's a stereotype, and nuns are not like that." So I'm reading this email in bed, and I turned to my now ex-wife, and I was like, um, I just got contacted by a nun about the story with your dad and the nuns beating him for being left-handed. And she's like, "Oh, no, 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 it wasn't the nuns." I was like, "Oh, shoot, that was my fault. It was the priests." And I was like, "Oh, can I respond to the nun and say, sorry, I didn't mean to defame nuns. It was actually the priests that were beating." And she's like, "I really wish that you wouldn't." So I can't remember. It was like Nun Betty or something. And so I sent her a note back. I'm like, "I'm really sorry. You know, it was sort of a cheap shot, and I appreciate you following up, and I'll try to be nicer and more fair with nuns in the future." I didn't follow up and say, "100% you were right. My father-in-law was beaten by the priests and not the nuns."
100% that should have been the follow-up. No, but it's the genetics behind the hair swirl, right, is really, really cool, and linking that to the environmental pressures, because we were setting up in chat before you came on, and a lot of people in chat actually mentioned that they, my parent or grandparent or even I was left-handed, but due to pressures in school or at home, I was like shoved very much in that
Yeah,
right-handed direction, and then we actually
yeah,
started going down the rabbit hole of, are you right-handed? Or what is your dominant hand? Like, what do you
yeah,
usually do stuff with? And someone in chat was like, well, I write with my right hand, but I do crochet and sewing with my
yeah.
left hand.
Yeah, and so there are some really fun things, and I mean honestly, there is this fun correlation between masturbation. So most people do have a dominant hand in masturbation, and most people, but I can tell you, not all, have that dominant hand as their dominant writing hand. The way that this is handled in research is that essentially there are a suite of phenotypes. So phenotypes have physical characteristics that determine what your dominant hand is, because there's such a big societal pressure, either because the nuns or the priests are beating you, or because it's just easier. Like notebooks are basically set up for you to write right-handed.
Scissors.
Um, but there are at least left-handed scissors. There are no left-handed notebooks,
But the
right?
fact that left-handed scissors need to exist, right? Like that you cannot use, if you're left-handed,
That's
regular
right.
scissors.
Yeah, no, 100%. So there are all these things that impact some aspects of handedness, and there's some things that are more subtle. So which hand do you actually hold a spoon with? Which hand do you hold a knife with? That seems to be less impacted by society around you, and it sort of snuck one past the goalie. So yes, you weren't allowed to write with your left hand, but you were allowed to use your spoon with your left hand.
So
So
are those more representative measurements then in terms of like
yeah.
what is in fact your dominant hand?
And so the game is the basically we look at multiple phenotypes, and so the spoon and knife use is one of the phenotypes that we look at, and like with many things, what you're trying to do is reduce confounding factors. Which hand you write with is confounded by so many things that there are other aspects that you look for. So which hand do you throw with? Which hand do you lead with your batting or stick handling or whatever a sport is? So there are different ways that you can try to address handedness that get away from some of the societal pressures. But the random thing I think was for me was one of the punchlines of that story is writing that piece. Like there's a genetic component 100%, there's a societal component 100%, but the really cool thing is there does seem to be just this random component as well.
And I like,
And
so for those who don't know, here's the hair swirl behind us of what that looks like. The takeaway was, if you're right-handed, your hair swirl is 100% of the time clockwise, and if you're left-handed, 50% of the time it'll be clockwise, and the other 50% of the time it'll be counterclockwise. And there is a big part of where that randomness is coming in. So like here again are those hair swirls, and what that corresponds to is not just an easy answer. It's not just like yes or no. It's gonna be, you're definitely right-handed if it's clockwise.
yeah, but so I'd have to look at that again, but I think you misspoke. Basically, if you have the rare whirl, half the time you're left-handed,
Right. Like, which is the
right? So
counterclockwise.
Yeah, so you can have the counterclockwise whirl and still be right-handed.
Hmm.
That's the coin flip part of that
Yeah,
that
and
comes
so
up.
that's like the unknown environmental or random chance fact that's driving you.
Yeah, definitely not environmental. That's the random chance. And I love the fact that the story is this guy literally took a bunch of grad students, went into a mall, and basically sat at the escalators and counted hair whirls and looked for a dominance in whirl either clockwise or counterclockwise. And the fun thing is they didn't actually have to determine whether you were right or left-handed because most of the people they're going to look at are actually right-handed. So what they're looking for is something that correlates but doesn't correlate perfectly with that handedness.
A couple of interesting questions from the chat is one, do you know any of instance where it was incentivized to be a lefty? So in any instance where it actually went like against the grain and how that data set might change things?
Yeah, so I don't, although I will tell you anecdotally when I started talking about this, actually, you know Jack Bateman. So
Hmm.
Jack Bateman is arguably the smartest guy that I've ever interacted with. Like in a room full of smart people, Jack Bateman is the smart guy. He's left-handed, and one of his two kids is left-handed. I was like, "Oh, really? Did you like encourage that?" He goes, "Well, yeah. Every time he started doing anything with his right hand, I'd hit him." I'm like, "Seriously? No, not seriously." But there is this thing that I think in the lefty world, there's a certain cachet, and so lefties, in some cases, will tend to promote lefty in their kids. I don't know anything society wide. I mean, one of the points that's in that paper, though, is that when you look at different cross sections of humanity, artists and architects tend to have a higher than 10%, 15% representation of left-handed. And there's some really cool speculation around whether that is a side effect or a driving effect. So, is creativeness correlated with being left-handed, or because you're left-handed, do you have to be creative in a right-handed dominant world? And so that tends to push you into creative aspects, right? So there are two different spins that you can put on that.
A couple of additional questions that I like these a lot. Do you know of any, like, if handedness has any relation to genetics, if you're forcing lefties to change to right-handedness or vice versa, is there any epigenetic change you could cause?
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, ironically, one of the grants that I was reviewing today had to do with epigenetics, and one of the issues with stress. So in this case, the stress would be would you forcing to use your non-dominant hand. We're just starting to scratch the surface on what changes are actually driven by what and where. So an issue with epigenetic changes is they'd have to be in the right tissue at the right place at the right time. So I don't know anybody who's looked at that. It's interesting, and it would be incredibly difficult because you could, depending on where you were looking, there could 100% be an epigenetic change, but you're looking at the wrong tissue at the wrong time, and you're going to miss that. So it's a very difficult thing to tease apart.
You'd have to be looking presumably across age and monitoring what the environmental pressure is as well and trying to standardize that probably.
Yeah,
Yeah, it'd be a
and
nightmare.
so tissue specific, age specific, it would have to be the right modification. There are lots of different epigenetic modifications that are out there. It's a tough game to play, but that's a really interesting idea.
And then do you know if you know heterochromia has any correlation with handedness? I've had both family and pets with different colored eyes, but never noticed their handedness.
I don't know that. That's a super cool question. Um, I don't know. That's really cool. So let's keep going on this, but remind me. I also wanted to talk about the snail thing, which I think
Yes,
is also
yes, we need
very
to talk
cool.
about Jeremy.
But yeah, so that are there any other so the handedness thing, I think surprisingly, I wrote that piece, quite a few years ago. And I think what we found since then is that we really don't know how we're finding out how little we actually know about the genetics of handedness. There was a really interesting article, much more recent, like in the last couple of years, that implicated a number of different genes that are involved with that. So it's not a single locus. There are lots of things that are modifying. A cat just went by. So one of the fun things is that different animals have different handedness. So cats are either right or left pawed, except for mine because they all have three paws. But
Are they
they
missing a leg?
Have we not had this conversation? I have three. We've had four, but we now have three-legged cats, and they're all missing different legs.
No, we've never had this conversation.
My dad was a carpenter, and so there are lots of accidents with kittens in a carpenter shop. Totally making that part up. But
Like, oh my God. Thanks.
once you adopt a three-legged cat, you get put on the three-legged cat short list. And so we've had a series of three-legged cats since then. But so cats have handedness, and they address their prey either as right-handed or left-handed. But it's split across the population, so there's an equal amount. Male dogs that lift a leg to pee, they don't show handedness, and so they're as likely to lift with their left leg or right leg. Um, there's been a lot of speculation as to what the evolutionary consequence or what the evolutionary driving force of the handedness would be. And one of the interesting things I was just looking at earlier today is that a lot of this has been very human centric, but handedness probably predates modern humans. So we've got decent fossil evidence that people that were either making flint tools had a dominant hand, so you can look at the pattern of flaking. And there are also things where you dress hides by holding them in your mouth and then scraping at them. And so there are patterns of wear on teeth that are consistent with a single-handedness. And we have really super small sample sizes, but that small sample size suggests that Neanderthals were right-handed, and that early proto-humans were also right-handed. So whatever's driving handedness is likely not modern human specific, but is earlier in our lineage. The striking thing is that we are predominantly right-handed. When you look at chimps either right-handed or left-handed. I think there's a bit of a predominance, but it's not the bias that we see. There's a lot of speculation around things like throwing, and I think it's because guys think that throwing is cool. And so obviously throwing is cool, and so that must be why we're all right-handed, because you've got to like nail down the whole development. So I haven't seen really good um, unbiased and not really gendered solutions for why we see this predominance.
Yeah, there's been a chat mentioned there might be also like if you're being trained to be left-handed, it would be in baseball for like being the pitcher and all that. Also, that side of things, those studies could also be like going in one direction versus another in terms of the gender. And you like you said, there's just a lot more that needs to be done to really balance out that question.
Yeah.
But it's really phenomenal that after so many years, we still don't know what the genetics are. Like the fact that you tell us there's a mystery thing, right? What do you
Yeah.
mean there's a mystery? That's like I know the genetics of hair color, but I don't know why I'm right or left-handed.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's I mean, so eye color, we've got a couple of genes that are the primary candidates, although surprisingly it doesn't really all fit together. So the two best candidates for eye color as far as correlating genetic diversity with brown and blue eyes, they don't make sense from the perspective of eye color. Like there's not an obvious tie between the proteins that are coded for those genes and the difference in pigment. But we've got a better idea with handedness. It's just shots in the dark.
DC Vignette today says in humans, apparently birth weight can play a big role in hand dominance. Maybe that could explain evolutionary difference as food and medical care was not as available going back through history.
So that's an interesting point. I didn't actually follow the link, but one of the points that was made in one of the handedness papers I was reading today said that you can actually see handedness in developing fetus. So, that was the statement, was that handedness starts in the womb, and I didn't go back and say, okay, what's the evidence that's there? So that those two things are not consistent, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but I don't think handedness is it's not entirely environmental. Because it runs in families and the patterns that we do see, there's definitely a genetic component that wouldn't be consistent with just birth weight or differences in birth weight.
And so, how does that connect, Thomas, to what all we've talked about tonight is to Jeremy?
Yeah, so it doesn't. Other than the fact that if you Google handedness, what pops up is this damn snail. It does 100%, and it's super cool. So Jeremy was this. Oh crap! I've got to get it wrong. Snails are right-handed, okay?
Yep.
And Jeremy is left-handed. And so this snail biologist is like, I've got this poor left-handed snail, And snail reproduction, they're hermaphrodites. They have both male and female genitalia, but they preferentially mate with other individuals. And they need to do it, at least in this species, and it's different in different species, but in this species of garden snail, they need to mate with a mate that has a genitalia on the same side.
So what does it mean, handedness in a snail? Because snails don't have hands.
No, they totally do. If you look at, so if you give snails enough time, the hands pop out, and yeah, you're right. So they don't have hands. So what they do have is a spiral, and so they have a right-handed spiral or a left-handed spiral.
So you're looking
So
at the shell, and you can easily ID what exactly it is.
yeah, and it's super obvious. And if you're into snails, it's the kind of thing that you can pick up pretty quickly. And in this species of garden snail, they're all right-handed. And so they had this 1 in 1,000 Jeremy,
because it was named after a liberal member of the British cabinet.
Okay. So there you go. So one of the things we didn't talk about in handedness was Obama was left-handed. So it could have been Obama, the snail. So they set out to find a mate for Jeremy because if the snail genitalia are not on the same side, they effectively can't mate. And so there's this huge scouring of the countryside for snails. They find 2 possible mates that are both left-handed. They bring them in, they mate together, and they ignore Jeremy. I was like, oh man, that is like high school all over again. And so those 2 snails happily mated, and poor Jeremy off on his own, doing his own thing.
And those 2 snails would also have needed each other to mate, right? So it's not just that it was a weird accident. Like they could only have mated with one another.
Well, right. And so the idea was, so you find these left-handed snails, they're all the same species. And so they bring in these prospective mates for Jeremy. They're physically able to mate, and psychologically they ignore Jeremy, and they happily mate together. There was eventually a female, another left-handed female, or not female, another left-handed individual, they're hermaphrodites, that was brought in, and Jeremy did apparently mate with this other left-handed individual. So when I was reading these stories initially, I was like, that's super cool. There's some sort of mutation that's been thrown off, and we've got this, backward spiraling snail. All of the offspring are right-handed, and all of the offspring of the offspring are right-handed.
Of these left-handed, Mr. Jeremy here, and Mrs. Jeremy, who are left-handed. So just to be clear about it, because they're hermaphroditic, are they both producing offspring independently?
Actually, that's a great point. I don't know. So the phrasing was that the other snail produced the eggs. So there may be like
both in either direction.
Yeah, something like that. But the offspring. So first off, the other 2 left-handed snails, they produce snails, and then Jeremy and his 3rd suitor, they produce snails. All of the snails from all of these left-handed matings are right-handed. All of the snails that are offspring of those matings are right-handed. So I think they're up to 3 generations now. So they've got kids, grandkids, great-grandkids. So what seems to be happening is these rare left-handed squirrels, rare left spiraling snails, are not a mutation. It's the flip of the coin. It's the random chance. And so that you develop right-handed. And so this is the typical thing. So instead of there being a rare mutation, there's just this rare screw up somewhere early in the developmental pattern that sends things down this pathway to a left-handed spiral instead of a right-handed spiral. And it's not genetic at all, because all of the offspring look like typical snails. So you've just got this 1 in 1,000 chance that something goes wrong, and you produce the wrong spiral. So while it's not directly related to handedness, it's the same idea that what drives development is a combination of genetics, the environment, and then a surprisingly high frequency of time. It's just random chance. And so Jeremy is just entirely just this random, not mutation, but random event that caused this incorrect development pattern.
So if you were to sequence Jeremy and all the individuals that Jeremy could not mate with, you're not going to find a genetic difference for that handedness. It's just some kind of error during development that switched it.
Yeah. And so the trick is, if you were to sequence Jeremy and Jeremy's colleagues and suitors, you would find so much variation that you would be tempted to say somewhere in this genetic variation, because we're genetically, like all organisms are genetically diverse, that we're expecting it to be genetic. And so we're going to look for those genetic differences. The simple crosses and just following the phenotype, following this left or right-handed spiral to the shell, that says it's not genetic, it's just random.
And so by random, so our friend Smikes is asking, flip of the coin, like you're saying, is 50-50, but what is the actual statistical chance of this? Like, what is that, like, extra variance in there, like, in terms of the chance there?
So the way the authors phrased it, it's 1 in 1,000. But given the fact that they were able to find like 16 left-handed snails across the entire United Kingdom, I think 1 in 1,000 is a rough estimate,
Okay.
and it's just super rare.
Interesting. Yeah, that's poor Jeremy. We've got y'all, for those interested in Jeremy, I've got a video on it in a little bit that we'll go into and talk a little bit more about the genetics of Jeremy. We had another question for you, Thomas, about back to the handedness, if you don't mind. From our friend Moo here. Confused studies have suggested that only 1/4 of the variance in handedness is explained by genetic effects, indicating that a substantial environmental influence is behind the individual differences in handedness. And that was from a 2018 paper that they found. What is the current state of in terms of knowledge of like the genetic influence of what happens with handedness?
Yeah, I think, I mean, those 2 points are consistent. So there is a genetic component, and this is why you see handedness that tends to follow in families. So if somebody in your family is left-handed, you can usually look and say somebody in the immediate, prior generation, one generation up, something like that, is left-handed. So um, it to say what the contribution is, basically, I think that our best understanding at the moment is to not be right-handed. There's a genotype set of alleles that are consistent with being not left-handed. Not right-handed. And then there's a random component to that at least according to some studies really is 50-50. And then on top of that, there's an environmental component, and that's changing through time. So there are different pressures against being left-handed now than there were 50 years ago, than there were 200 years ago. So that societal pressure is very plastic. The genetic component is probably pretty consistent. And then the random component, as far as I can tell, is consistent. So you've got alleles that are there. You've got this coin toss random effect that here really does seem to be 50-50. And then you've got this moving target of what the environmental effects are. And that those environmental effects, this is sort of important, are going to depend on what aspect of handedness we're looking at. So if it has to do with writing, there's a different impact than if it has to do with spoon use.
So when in looking at these studies as well, that's an important thing to dissect away and try to figure out what exactly are you looking for in terms of dominant hand? What phenotype are you chasing?
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too the way you framed it in terms of like that write up that you. And I'll be sharing Thomas's write up here on the Discord and in the chat as well. Is the influence of societal pressures on writing on handedness versus like using a spoon and having soup, right?
Yeah,
That's a really really cool difference between the two.
yeah.
I think this is a very important question from Smikes. Beside curiosity and genetics, why does something like this matter? How does someone pitch a grant to study something like this?
Yeah, so if we go back to things like the SDI thing, so if we're talking about grooming and promiscuous ground squirrels, then what we may be interested in is how do we maintain biological diversity? If the question really is handedness in people, there's a lot. So outside of SciAnts, I run an accessible sport program, and so I run a rowing program for people with generally physical, but essentially with any disabilities. A lot of the ways that we adapt sport for people with different disabilities has to do with understanding what is or what isn't working, and trying to understand the genetic component, the environmental component to things like handedness helps us to help other, basically people that have got some sort of clinical issue with handedness. Do we understand what drives this or what drives that? So there's some medical implications to understanding what's driving handedness. Handedness is a bit odd in that there's not an enormous downside to being the wrong hand, but it's a phenotype that we can get a handle on trying to understand, that may give us better insight to a variety of phenotypes. So, we talk about model species. So I study fruit flies to understand the genetics of stress because I can do experimental things to fruit flies that I wouldn't do in humans. Understanding how the genetics of handedness works can give me a better idea of how the genetics of anything, any complex phenotype works in humans. And so the more we understand that one connection, the better we have, a better chance we have of understanding a variety of different connections. So each individual phenotype is a bit of a puzzle. Um, and a lot of it has to do with, are we asking the right questions? Well, handedness may be a good place to start with what are the questions that we need to ask to understand human phenotypes.
Is there, and the other thing too is right asking it in the right organism. Do you have any insight on if I were to write a grant on handedness, what would be a good organism, do you think, to study something like that in?
I think you could basically, you could look at handedness in, so one, you need to have something that has left and right. Depending on the question you were asking, different organisms could be appropriate. So one of the things that I mentioned in that piece is, as an undergrad, I was working on cephalopod behavior, and I was in a lab that was doing something else. I had some free time. I was like, this is a really cool conundrum. Um, Cephalopods, octopus, don't seem to be able to do left and right. And so there was an evolutionary argument that the reason is that the arms in cephalopods are so incredibly complex and the brains are so rudimentary. I mean, the brain of an octopus is essentially just a slug brain boosted up a bit, right? But they can do really complex things. But octopus arms are incredibly complicated. And so because they don't have an internal skeleton, they're almost infinitely variable. And there's only so much processing power. And so one of the things that may have been lost is understanding left versus right. So I went in and was trying to test this in a related cephalopod called cuttlefish. They look like rugby balls with tentacles on the front. When I was writing that piece, I reached out to actually the person who brought me to the bonobo talk, who luckily is still talking to me, and hopefully has forgotten my comment about the size of bonobo testicles. And she's like, yeah, actually, it's sort of cool. There's been studies since then that suggest that maybe octopus can do left and right. So there's some interesting questions that we can ask around handedness that have to do with basically neuroprocessing, developmental biology, lots of different aspects that come into that. So, what's the utility of understanding handedness? Handedness is weird, and weird things can often tell us things about the rules that are driving biology. So, one of the fundamental questions is, why is everybody right-handed? Okay, developmental, and so we have a hard time with that, and part of that we're asking the question at the wrong place, because handedness may be so evolutionarily ancient that it was ingrained early on and not something that's later in human evolution. But part of it is just like the mechanics, what's involved with being handed. There's a lot of potential correlation between handedness and brain asymmetry, and some of that seems to be up in the air. When I was reading through some of it this afternoon, um, people seem to be questioning some of the things that we thought we knew about brain development and handedness. And so, depending on what the question is you want to ask, different organisms may be the right organism. So the cephalopod question was really interesting because you have these really rudimentary brains that are capable of really impressive suites of analysis and problem solving, but seem to struggle with the idea of left and right. So, even fruit flies, you can train them to do things in different ways and ask interesting questions that are appropriate to that model system.
Question about ambidexterity for you. I know we're rounding out. We only get Thomas for an hour, y'all, so we've about hit that hour mark. Is ambidextrix actually a thing, or is it just the ability to use both hands well?
Yeah, so I think again, this isn't my field, but the way that I read the literature is that it seems to be a thing, because it basically, you've got dominant right and not dominant right, and not dominant right includes both dominant left and ambidextrous. So my reading is that people are treating these as 3 different categories, but most of the time the not right is grouped together. So I don't know if I'm sure that people have tried to tease that apart. It may be because of the societal pressure, it's really difficult to tease apart you're good with both hands because of societal pressure versus you are predominantly left.
Gotcha. We got one last question. Handedness has a whole submarket when it comes to mice and keyboards, which are wholly right-handed. The government needs things to be universal for expediency. I wonder how LLMs have been trained on handedness.
You have to tell me what an LLM is.
Pickle old man Murray Rick. Is that like the linear language models? Remember, y'all, that is true. All the different acronyms are very different. We've got people who come in who are artists who do WIPs, they do WIPs, and I'm always like, oh, wing interference patterns on fruit flies? What? No, works in progress. Large language models. AI and chat GTP type things.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. There's a huge industry around that, and yeah, I'm not sure what the answer to that is. Handedness is not perfect. Obviously, it's not perfect. When I was a PhD student and I was doing sequence analysis just 24/7, I completely tweaked my right wrist because my mouse wasn't particularly ergonomic. And so for the entire last year of my PhD, I was mousing with my left hand. I actually got reasonably good, and it meant that nobody ever used my computer. Because if you sat down to use my computer, the mouse is on the wrong side and it would drive everybody crazy. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but there is a huge amount of interest in that, certainly.
Nice. And Thomas, I figure we'll let you go. Can you leave us with like maybe your favorite or most interesting handedness fact that we haven't touched on tonight?
I think we've basically hit all of my favorite ones. I think that the most interesting thing that came to me when I was reading through things like bat fellatio and ground squirrel masturbation was that the number of hypotheses that seem to be driven by our own perspective. So one of the things that I now make, essentially every student who takes a class with me has to read a paper that the title basically summarizes down to in a good way. And it was written by a series of researchers. I think they may all be Canadian, but they're at least predominantly Canadian. And they're Indigenous researchers. So they have a background as part of Indigenous communities here in Ontario and across Canada. And the point of their paper is that there is no view of nowhere. And so we have this idea that science is objective and removed from the world, and it's 100% not. The kind of questions that we ask reflect our own personal bias. And so the point of this paper was saying taking a traditional Western approach isn't unbiased, it's just reflecting the traditional Western bias. So when I was reading through these explanations of, why do bats perform fellatio, I was like, okay, the questions that you're asking are driven by your own perspective on fellatio, and then potentially your perspective on what it's doing for bats. And that's what seemed to crop up with this ground squirrel thing, was that the explanations that we have for ground squirrels started off with a very human perspective, and then those obviously they didn't work. And so the author was like, okay, well, if the answers are not answers that make sense from a human perspective, what are the potential answers? And that's where the STI thing came in. But even reading that, I'm like, okay, but do we have evidence for STIs? So I think an interesting central punchline was that the kind of questions that we're asking are driven by us, but the kind of answers that we're looking for are also very much driven by the bias that we bring into the questions that we're asking. And that goes back to, my whole Twitter thing on the handedness of masturbation. I'm asking this question from a very male-central perspective, and it didn't even occur to me that this was a male-centered perspective until this woman came up to me and said, that's really not appropriate for women. I did not know that. That is my bias in the way I was asking the questions.
Thank you for joining us, Thomas. Happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah,
Science is for everyone. All
See you next
backgrounds,
time.
all
Thank
ages,
you,
all
Thomas.
genders, and all walks of life deserve an education. Come be one of us. Spark your